Imagine a Hollywood world where private messages control public perception, where behind-the-scenes conversations shape careers and reputations, and one voice can orchestrate the fate of an entire cast and crew. Today we're diving into explosive, unsealed texts that reveal shocking manipulations, secret strategies, and the hidden drama that turned a simple film project into a high-stakes battlefield. You won't believe what these messages show about power control and betrayal in Tinseltown. This is the story no one wanted you to see. Here we go again, and if you thought the story stopped where we left it earlier today, think again, because what is now coming out changes how every single interaction on that set needs to be viewed. And once you see how these conversations unfold, you cannot unsee the pattern. Because this is not about one disagreement or one bad day or one misunderstanding. This is about influence, control, narrative shaping, and a slow, steady pressure campaign that played out behind closed doors while a very different story was being sold publicly. And today we are going to walk through exactly how that happened, step by step, conversation by conversation, because once the unsealed messages start speaking for themselves, the tone shifts immediately. And suddenly the public image no longer lines up with the private reality. And that disconnect is where the real story lives. So let's start right where the tension was quietly building long before anyone knew there was a problem, because months before the premiere, before the headlines, before the social media unfollows, before the carefully worded statements, there were private messages being sent that reveal an entirely different energy, one where alliances were being formed, loyalty was being tested, and people were being nudged into positions they clearly did not want to be in. And one of the clearest examples of this dynamic appears in the exchange between Blake Lively and her co-star, Brandon Slenar, a conversation that on the surface looks casual, friendly, even jokey, but underneath carries a very different weight, because when you read it closely, you start to see hesitation on one side and direction on the other, and that imbalance matters. Brandon had just come off working closely with Blake. He had benefited professionally from her recommendation. He was cast in another major project by someone in her close circle, and that context matters, because when someone with that level of influence reaches out, the pressure is not always explicit. It does not need to be threats or demands. Sometimes it is tone, sometimes it is implication, sometimes it is the subtle reminder of who opened doors and who still can. And in this exchange, Brandon is polite, responsive, careful. He acknowledges messages, reacts with likes and laughs, but rarely pushes back, rarely initiates, rarely drives the conversation. And that silence speaks volumes, because while he is trying to keep things neutral, Blake is actively reframing the narrative. She jokes about selling the movie around him. Instead of Justin, she refers to dressing him up to promote it. She positions Justin as someone who should not be centered regardless of process, and that line alone is critical, because process matters in filmmaking, credit matters, authorship matters. And when someone says regardless of process, what they are really saying is outcome first, justification later. And as the conversation continues, Blake repeatedly frames herself as someone protecting the project, holding things together, managing chaos, while subtly casting Justin as the source of instability. She claims he took things from her cut without authorization. She describes him as scrambling, as acting irrationally. And notice how these claims are presented not as questions, not as uncertainty, but as settled truth. And when Brandon responds, he initially reacts with surprise, but then begins to mirror her language, which is exactly how influence works. It is not instant, it is gradual. First comes empathy, then alignment, then repetition, and eventually agreement. And this is where the dynamic shifts, because Brandon begins to echo the idea that Justin is hurting his own future, that he is lacking foresight, that his public persona does not match his private behavior. And once that door opens, the framing is set, and Blake leans into it harder, positioning herself as someone who could have allowed him to succeed, who could have protected him, who chose restraint, even as she claims he created havoc everywhere he goes. And again, listen to the framing. She is not simply disagreeing with him. She is narrating his entire character arc and assigning herself the role of gatekeeper, the one who could make or break careers, the one who held back information for the sake of the work. And this savior narrative repeats itself over and over across different conversations with different people, and that consistency is what makes it impossible to ignore, because this is not one-off venting, this is a pattern, and the pattern becomes even clearer when we look at how other people around the project were being spoken to and about. Because this was not limited to one co-star, this extended to the author, to agents, to friends, to collaborators, and the message remained remarkably consistent. Justin was framed as unstable, untrustworthy, inappropriate, while Blake positioned herself as the rational adult in the room doing damage control. And that narrative was being fed to people who openly admitted they had no direct negative experiences of their own, which is a crucial point. Because when opinions are formed entirely through second-hand accounts, responsibility matters, and that responsibility sits with the source. And one of the most revealing aspects of these unsealed materials is how openly some of these opinions were shaped in real time, through private encouragement messages and emotional reinforcement. Because when a friend responds to a complaint by escalating it, labeling someone fake, a liar, a narcissist without personal knowledge, it does not just validate feelings, it amplifies perception. And once that amplification happens, it is very difficult to walk back. And that brings us to another set of messages, where Blake is speaking to a friend about Justin in language that is deeply dismissive, mocking, and emotionally charged. She describes a meeting that left her upset, then immediately undercuts his emotional reaction by calling it a performance. She recounts him crying, then ridicules it. And that contrast is striking, because publicly the narrative has been about emotional safety, about respect, about accountability, but privately there is mockery, there is minimization, there is a sense of superiority. And again, this is not being presented as speculation, she presents it as fact. And her friend responds by escalating it, further predicting meltdowns, attributing motives, diagnosing personality traits, and encouraging her to gloat when the downfall comes. And that matters, because these conversations show a feedback loop, where negative interpretations are rewarded, reinforced, and expanded. And over time, that loop shapes behavior, decisions, and public outcomes. And this is where the suspense deepens, because while all of this is happening quietly, another campaign is unfolding, one that directly impacts the film itself, the premiere, and the public rollout. Because behind-the-scenes messages between agents reveal growing concern that this internal conflict was being actively steered in a direction that would exclude Justin from his own project. And according to those messages, the push did not come from a studio decision or a neutral logistical issue. It came from pressure, threats of non-attendance, and coordinated alignment among cast and author, all of which were being attributed to Blake. And those messages are not emotional venting, they are professional alarms, agents warning that this is bad for the movie, that this is being orchestrated, that someone needs to intervene and power her down. And that language is not casual, it reflects a situation that has moved beyond disagreement into crisis management. And at the same time, separate messages show Blake telling outside collaborators that the studio removed the director and asked her to take over a claim that does not align with what actually happened. And that misrepresentation is critical, because it shows how the story was being told differently depending on the audience. And that dual narrative is where credibility starts to fracture. Because when one person is presenting themselves as the hero, the fixer, the reluctant leader, the emotional victim, the professional savior in every context, while the other person is consistently framed as chaotic, unstable, inappropriate, and disposable, it raises a fundamental question. Who is controlling the story and why? And this is where we pause, because everything that follows builds on this foundation: the manipulation of perception, the gradual alignment of voices, the quiet reshaping of events, and the public consequences that followed. And what comes next connects these private messages directly to the decisions that reshaped the entire production. And once that connection is made, the story no longer looks like a misunderstanding. It looks like a strategy, and that is where things really start to unravel. As we move deeper into what these unsealed communications actually reveal, the picture becomes even more unsettling. Because once you strip away the public statements, the carefully worded interviews, and the polished talking points, what remains is a trail of private influence that reshaped how people felt, how they acted, and ultimately how the entire situation unfolded. And this is where the story stops being about two individuals in conflict and starts becoming about power dynamics inside an industry that rewards silence, compliance, and proximity to influence. Because the same themes we saw in those earlier messages keep repeating with different names, different contexts, but the same underlying structure. And that is no accident, because patterns do not form randomly, they form through behavior and reinforcement. And one of the most telling aspects of this entire situation is how often Blake positioned herself as both the emotional center and the professional authority in every room she entered, even when she was not officially in that role. And that positioning mattered, because when someone speaks as though they are the final word, others begin to act as though they are. And that is exactly what we see in the conversations involving the author Colleen Hoover, because in her deposition she admits something that is crucial. She did not personally experience the behaviors she later cited as reasons for distancing herself from Justin. She was told about them, and those accounts came primarily from Blake. And once that admission is on the record, it changes how everything else must be interpreted, because it establishes that at least part of the collective reaction was built on second-hand narratives, not first-hand. interactions, and when those narratives are delivered with emotional urgency, moral framing, and repeated reinforcement, they take on a weight that feels undeniable, even if the underlying facts are not independently verified. And that is how reputations begin to shift long before any formal accusation is made. And this is also where we see how social pressure was applied through coordinated actions, such as unfollowing on social media, distancing at events, and selective silence, because those moves do not happen in a vacuum. They happen when people believe there is a consensus forming, and that consensus is often shaped by whoever speaks first and loudest behind the scenes. And in this case, the messages suggest that Blake was not just expressing discomfort, she was actively guiding how others responded to Justin, both privately and publicly. And that guidance extended into decisions about who could attend major events like the premiere. Because when agents are messaging one another in alarm, saying that an actor is being pushed out of their own film not because of misconduct proven on set, but because of a coordinated pressure campaign, that is a serious escalation. And according to those messages, the threat was clear: if Justin attended, others would not, and that kind of ultimatum puts studios and partners in an impossible position, because the optics of conflict can be just as damaging as the conflict itself. And so decisions get made not based on truth but on risk avoidance, and that is how narratives win without ever being tested. And while all of this is happening, another layer is unfolding in private messages between Blake and friends, where the language becomes even more revealing, because in those conversations there is no pretense of professionalism, there is no careful wording, there is mockery, dismissal, and a striking lack of empathy for someone she claims made her feel unsafe. And that contradiction matters, because when someone describes another person as having an emotional breakdown, then ridicules it as performative, it raises questions about sincerity and intention. And when those comments are paired with encouragement from friends to gloat, to anticipate downfall, to diagnose personality flaws, it paints a picture of someone not seeking resolution but dominance and control. And again, this is not speculation, this is what the words themselves show, and those words matter because they influence how decisions are made going forward, including creative control and future planning. And this becomes especially clear in the messages involving discussions of the sequel, because even before any public fallout, there are private conversations where Blake and the author are talking as though the next installment already belongs to them, despite legal ownership resting elsewhere. And that sense of inevitability suggests that plans were being made based on assumed outcomes, not negotiated agreement. And when those assumptions are challenged, conflict becomes inevitable, and that may help explain the increasing hostility in later messages. Because when someone believes something is already theirs, any obstacle feels like an attack, and any resistance feels like betrayal, and that mindset can justify extreme responses in the name of protecting what one believes they deserve. And this brings us to the moment where even longtime partners begin expressing alarm. Because when someone who has worked closely with Justin for years privately refers to Blake as uncontrollable, as someone no one can manage, that is not a casual statement. It is an acknowledgement that the situation has spiraled beyond normal professional conflict, and that everyone involved is now reacting rather than leading. And that sense of chaos is echoed in the language used to describe the environment, one where people feel trapped trying to navigate around a central force, rather than collaborating as equals. And again, this does not mean one person is wholly right or wrong, but it does mean the dynamic itself has become unhealthy. And when dynamics become unhealthy, truth becomes secondary to survival, and that is when narratives harden, positions calcify, and accountability disappears. And what makes this even more compelling is how consistently Blake frames herself as powerless in public. While exercising significant power in private, she speaks of being a woman in the industry, of needing confidence, of having to protect herself, yet the messages show her directing agents, influencing authors, shaping co-star behavior, and redefining creative authority. And that contradiction is not about gender or emotion, it is about alignment between words and actions. And when those two things do not match, trust erodes, and once trust erodes, every action is reinterpreted through suspicion. And that is exactly what we see as these conversations progress, because everything Justin does is framed as manipulation, every emotional response is framed as strategy, every creative disagreement is framed as misconduct. And that framing leaves no room for misunderstanding or repair, because once someone is cast as a villain, nothing they do can redeem them. And that is the most dangerous part of all of this, because it locks everyone into a single storyline with no exit. And as we move forward, the consequences of that lock-in become impossible to ignore, because the professional fallout, the legal actions, the public backlash, all trace back to this moment where private narratives solidified into public positions. And once that happened, the story took on a life of its own. And in the next part, we will connect these internal communications directly to the external actions that followed and show how what began as private influence became public consequence, and why that shift matters more than anything else. As the unsealed conversations continue to unfold, what becomes increasingly clear is that the private messages were not isolated incidents or casual venting, but rather part of a sustained and highly coordinated effort to control the narrative and influence everyone involved in the production and surrounding projects. And the depth of this orchestration becomes apparent when you look at how she interacted with multiple people across different levels of the production and beyond, from co-stars to authors to agents to collaborators. Everyone who had a potential voice or influence over public perception was being subtly guided toward a specific understanding, and in many cases toward specific actions that served her objectives. And the fascinating part is how these communications reveal a pattern of framing blame elsewhere and establishing herself as the moral professional and emotional authority in each exchange. Because whether she was messaging Brandon, Slenar, or Colleen, Hoover, or her friends, the language was consistent. She cast herself as managing chaos, protecting the integrity of the work, and ensuring that those around her were positioned correctly, while portraying Justin as erratic, selfish, and ultimately responsible for any potential fallout. And the careful reader can see that this pattern extended into strategic decisions about promotion, attendance, and public appearances, because according to agent communications and corroborating statements, she directly influenced decisions about who would attend premieres, who would participate in marketing events, and who would publicly support the project. And those decisions were not based on logistics or artistic vision, but rather on shaping perception and managing who could be seen in association with whom. And that strategy becomes even more consequential when you consider how early it started. Because months before the premiere, long before any social media posts, long before interviews were conducted, there were private conversations that laid the foundation for what would eventually be perceived publicly as a crisis. And in that sense, the timing of the communications is as important as the content, because it demonstrates forethought, planning, and an understanding of the leverage she held over both relationships and perception. And it is in these exchanges that the combination of humor, manipulation, and emotional signaling is most evident, because jokes that might seem harmless on the surface were often paired with pointed observations that framed Justin as incapable or problematic. And the repetition of these observations across different audiences reinforced the perception that his actions were not merely mistakes but fundamental character flaws. And in many of the conversations, we see subtle coaching, where she encouraged co-stars to behave in certain ways to align with the narrative she was constructing. And while these suggestions were often couched in friendly banter or professional guidance, the cumulative effect was a coordinated shaping of how others would act and speak, both privately and publicly. And what makes this even more dramatic is how the private reinforcement loop operated, because her friends would read a message describing Justin as a narcissist, a clown, or a source of chaos, and then respond by escalating the language, agreeing, predicting meltdowns, and even encouraging gloating over potential missteps. And that reinforcement validates the perspective being pushed and amplifies its influence, which is a psychological phenomenon we see consistently in organizational dynamics and social influence research. But in this context, it has very real consequences for public perception and career trajectories, and those consequences begin to materialize in the way decisions were made around promotional events for the film. Because once you have a network of aligned voices reiterating a consistent narrative, the probability that external observers will perceive that narrative as truth increases significantly. And that is precisely what appears to have happened, as noted in private messages between agents and production staff, who express alarm about the coordinated pressure to exclude Justin from the premiere and other events, not because of any formal misconduct, but because a narrative of instability and unreliability had been pre-framed and reinforced privately and then leveraged publicly. And at the same time, we see Blake positioning herself as the hero, the stabilizing force, the protector of the project, and the arbiter of fairness, which is compelling from a storytelling perspective, because it frames her simultaneously as victim and agent. And that dual role creates a complex dynamic where any criticism she receives can be interpreted as unfair attacks or misinterpretation, because she has already established herself as morally aligned and professionally competent in the eyes of her allies and the people she is communicating with. And the more you read these messages, the more it becomes clear that this duality was deliberate and carefully maintained, because it allowed her to manage both internal perception among collaborators and external perception among the public and press. And when you connect that with the repeated emphasis on protecting the work and the franchise ownership she projects, a narrative that she is both caretaker and leader, which serves to rationalize any aggressive maneuvering. Because in her framing, it is necessary for the greater good and the success of the project. And those maneuvers are not just professional, they are deeply personal. Because many of the messages include references to past experiences, frustrations, and perceived slights, which she then uses as justification for her current actions. And that is why the communications about the author Colleen Hoover are so telling. Because Colleen repeatedly admits that her impressions of Justin were influenced entirely by Blake, which underscores the reach of this influence. Because it shows that perceptions were being actively shaped in the absence of direct experience. And that is a critical point, because it means the narrative was no longer based on observed behavior or first-hand knowledge. It was being constructed through the lens of private messaging and guided interpretation. And when those guided interpretations are then shared with others, whether through social media, cues, selective attendance, or private communications, the narrative begins to solidify in public perception. And conclusion, what these unsealed messages reveal is a world behind the cameras where influence, power, and perception were carefully orchestrated, where private conversations shaped public outcomes, and where narratives were constructed long before they reached the audience. It shows how personal dynamics, professional relationships, and emotional manipulation intertwined to create a reality that was controlled and directed by a single voice. And understanding this helps explain why events unfolded the way they did, and why reputations were affected so dramatically. It also underscores the power of private influence on public perception, and reminds us that what we see on the surface is often just a fraction of the true story.